country, steel is 80% of each of those wind turbines. You just saw the happy wind turbines in that video. It's part of many solar installation systems, the balance of systems. It's part of many cars. Concrete is a major commodity in industrialization and globalization all over the world. These commodities aren't going away, and they have been for China just a huge economic driver. This is a large sector. It accounts, as you see here, for a large amount, 72% of the CO2 emissions in China. And it's also just a big sector economically for many specific regions. And there's no really clear path to cleaning it up or making it zero emission. Making steel production and concrete production zero emission is very difficult, if not impossible. So China makes about half the world's steel right now. And about 20% of the world's entire steel production is based in this Qinghai region, in Hebei particularly. This is a major cause of Hebei's air pollution. We did a study last year just showing the contribution of the iron and steel industry to air pollution. And essentially cleaning up these sectors, cleaning up would have a huge improvement on air quality. What's been happening so far in terms of policy, and you've seen this, anyone who follows this region, is that the central government will set air pollution standards for individual cities. And then Beijing, for instance, the mayor of Beijing, reacted to those standards by taking 100 factories that were heavy industry and moving them out of Beijing in order to fix Beijing's air pollution problem. But he moved them into Hebei, which is next door, and already has a huge air pollution problem. So I think one thing the Paris Agreement tells us, and we just have to keep it in our minds in terms of the economic transition we're all talking about, is these are not local economic problems, these are global economic problems. And moving this production from place to place doesn't actually change its carbon emission profile, though it may help address the emissions. So iron and steel, obviously a huge piece of the Chinese economy. It is a major driver for local economies, which makes it politically difficult to address. Shutting down the steel mills, which is something the Chinese government has been doing a lot of lately, shutting down coal and steel, is not easy when you're looking at regions of the country that have political power. And it also, on the other side of the jobs equation, these are major job creators. These are job creators in steel plants, in coal, that are actually fairly good jobs for many people and create have a large multiplier effect with other industries. So what do we do about this sort of tension between a very important economic sector that has again been a driver for the country, but also for specific regions, that also is such a contributor worldwide to carbon emissions and again locally to air pollution? Well, there's a couple things you can do. You can make it more efficient. And this is something that I think a McKinsey study has shown that China is able to increase its energy efficiency by about 24% with certain technology shifts. I will say absolutely industrial efficiency is important, but most countries, the US and increasingly China, have done a lot already to increase efficiency and increase production and productive capacity. In particular, the US has made huge inroads, and in China, what we're seeing today is that with the slowdown and shutting down a number of the steel plants, the least productive plants are being shut down. So pretty much the more efficient plants are staying standing. So I am not saying this is not an important thing to do, but it cannot get us all the way there. One important thing that plants can do, and you're seeing a lot of this in the US and in some European countries, is using waste heat to sort of cogeneration, using waste heat to power factories. But again, there's room to grow here, there's room to move here, but it's not as big as it needs to be. More interesting to some extent is this issue of sort of structural changes in how steel in particular is produced. And one thing that's interesting, we were looking into steel production in China last year, and one interesting thing that we found is that China just doesn't recycle all that much steel. It's actually one of the countries with the lowest percent of recycled steel as opposed to new steel production. Recycling is extremely good for making a plant more efficient. In the past, China hasn't been a big recycler in part because there just wasn't a lot of steel floating around. When a country is developing and urbanizing, it uses an enormous amount of new steel. countries like the United States are constantly taking down buildings, right? We're taking the Bay Bridge down right now, and that will all become recycled steel. I think it's actually being shipped to China. Somebody can dispute this, but I think that steel is going to China. However, many of the buildings in China that were built in the 1980s are now coming down, and that creates a whole new influx of steel that could be recycled. And this could be scrap. Using scrap could be a very big deal in China's industrial sector. It's something to really look at for those of us who are sort of climate watchers. It is necessary to do some industrial upgrading to recycle steel. You have to switch to a new kind of furnace, which is actually more energy efficient. Electric arc furnaces at existing plants. But switching to arc furnaces, recycling steel could actually result in a 75% energy savings compared to the current steel making, the way that it's made now with iron incorporated into the steel. It's not easy to get China to do this kind of policy right now because of exactly what Pete just talked about, which is that the entire country is focused on shifting from an industrial economy to a service-based economy. So there's not a lot of investment going in on the industrial side. But I would argue that there should be. Steel is not going away globally. If you look at this chart, this is projected steel stocks per capita, and you can see that countries like the US, European countries have leveled off in terms of steel needs, steel demand per capita, because we're essentially building and rebuilding. But countries like China and India are urbanizing at an enormous rate and building all kinds of new stuff, which will need an enormous amount of steel or steel substitute like carbon fiber or other types of materials that we can talk about that are lower carbon. When we think about the Paris Agreement and we think about what we've all committed to globally, I think it's just incumbent on us again to think globally. Peter's actually absolutely right that China as a country is in the midst of trying to move from an industrial-based economy to a service-based economy. That makes a lot of sense, where China is economically and from a carbon perspective, but where is the steel production going when that happens? It is not, this kind of demand chart shows you, it's not going to go away. We can come up with better materials, we can come up with better production, we can make it more efficient, but worldwide industrial commodity production is something we will have to address, not only because of urbanization rates, but also because we want the world to build more of those wind turbines and those solar systems and those grid towers and all of those systems that will themselves need commodity production. So I'll leave you with that question. Sort of how do we as the globe and how does China and the US as two countries working together think about these big issues facing us on transformation? Where are we going? Where are we now? Where are we going to? And how do we do that in the most carbon efficient world in a global context? And that is it for me. Thank you so much. I look forward to the other talks.
Thank you, Kate. Our next speaker is Julio Friedman. He is the Senior Advisor on Energy Innovation at the Lawrence Livermore Lab, which is, as you know, is a hotbed of a lot of energy research. Dr. Julio also previously has worked on clean coal, carbon management, oil and gas systems, clean fossil energy. I think he has touched upon just about everything. And he also has done some research in smart grids and energy systems analysis, which are very critical going forward. And he was also a faculty of University of Maryland. It looks like we are a lot of them should form a union here. Thank you.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you for Li Wang for suggesting my name. And of course, thank you to Guo Shuang for hosting this event. Thank you for BAIC for helping convene this event. I'm delighted to be here, and it's very important, it's very timely. I also want to thank in advance the interpreters. I have a lot of information, so buckle up, and we'll try to get through it. I've been to China in different roles about 32 times now, so many times over the past 8 years. Part of that was when I was leading one of the clean energy research centers that Secretary Chu had mentioned. The reason why I've done this so much is that if, as others have said, if the United States and China can't work together on this, it's all over. This is the end game. This is the ball game, is the United States and China working together on clean energy. The good news is we've made a lot of progress. I think Paris was a major event in terms of getting a new business model in which every country makes a commitment. It's like a giant weight loss club where everybody says they're going to lose 5 pounds. In this, we have 2 different targets, the 2-degree target, which has been talked about, as well as a 1.5-degree target. Very, very hard, but part of the discussion forward. In order to come into force, it needs 55 countries representing 55% of global emissions. As of today, 31 countries joined today, so we are now at 60 countries. So we are quite close to ratification now, actually, and 48% of emissions. So we're getting quite close. And both the United States and China signed the agreement and ratified. In addition, at Paris, there was a separate event committed to new investment and innovation. I cannot stress how important this is. 20 nations said they were going to double their research and development budget. For the United States, that is an additional $5 billion. $5 billion is our baseline, so an additional $5 billion commitment. Worldwide, the sum is $15 billion, so an additional $15 billion worth of investment. I stress this because it underscores how low our current investment is. How low our current investment is. The U.S. pharmaceutical industry gets $15 billion of government money. And the energy, which is a much larger enterprise, gets 1/3 of the money. So we need collectively as a world to put a lot more, and this is very important. In addition, Bill Gates and a bunch of his rich friends have also committed to bring in some money. Between the government money, the private money, or philanthropic money, hopefully we can get more private capital flowing into this well by reducing the risk quickly. I'll note that these 3 guys were on the stage, and so it actually matters where this all goes. To give you a backdrop, people have talked about deep decarbonization already. I want to take a moment and just stress this again. If you believe in climate science, you got to believe the climate math. And the climate math is bad. This is a diagram that was made to help explain this. To hit the 1.5-degree target, we have 6 years to zero out global emissions. 6. Yeah, that's the appropriate response. Jesus. We won't make it. To hit a 2-degree target, Secretary Chu didn't say it, but his math is we have 20 years to hit that target, which we also will not make. We are nowhere close to a trajectory where we are moving quickly enough. This has, among other things, raised this question of something people call a carbon bubble. And Mark Carney, the governor of the Bank of England, has been the most clear-eyed discussant of this, I believe. And he said something particular I want to draw your attention to. Even if that estimate is even approximately correct, it would render the vast amount of hydrocarbon stranded reserves. Unless you have CCS with it, which would also alter those economics. So this says a couple of things. One, there is actually a way to not strand those assets with carbon capture and storage, but also the economics will change. So in that context, I want to start today's discussion with how innovation happens and what the prices are today. Because most people don't know these things, so it's helpful to know how innovation happens and what the prices are. So the way innovation happens is commonly thought of as policymakers make a decision and that turns into innovation. Hogwash. It never happens that way. Usually the way it happens is technology gets better and better and cheaper, and that makes the policymakers able to make a decision. They can suddenly go, oh, it's cheap enough now, the price is low enough, now we can do something. When that policy change happens, it makes the finance possible. There's things like investment tax credits and feed-in tariffs and all those other things, and then you can build and deploy the infrastructure you need. That finance, of course, makes it easier to invest in the technology. Because if you know you're going to make money, then if you drop the cost, you get a competitive advantage. So the question I ask today is, where does the innovation happen in this space? It actually happens with all of them. We innovate the policy, we innovate the finance, we innovate the technology, we also innovate business models. And many of the people in this room do that business model innovation to make money and commercialize their technology. But I want you to leave thinking, though, the technology enables the policy enables the finance, so we need to invest in the innovation and move it along faster in a real way. So what are the prices today? This is from Lazard. These are unsubsidized cost of electricity, so this is just power. The orange squares are distributed generation. The first thing I want you to recognize is there's a range for all of these things. There is no one price for solar or for coal. There's a range of prices as a function of technology option, as a function of market conditions, as a function of resource, cost of labor, all these things. So at any given market, there's a range. The second thing is, if you're looking at something that's below $100 per megawatt hour, there's actually a lot of options today. In some markets, solar will be the cheapest option. In some market, wind will be the cheapest option. In some market, biomass will be the cheapest option, like in Brazil. In some market, natural gas or coal with carbon capture and sequestration will be the cheapest market. The red lines, by the way, are my lines in terms of what the prices are for those fuels. Natural gas, combined cycle, and coal with carbon capture and storage. So there's in fact a lot of competitive technologies out there and a lot of opportunities to think about deploying it. There's also, that means there's lots of room to reduce these costs through innovation. Quick point, the finance matters in this. Those super low solar prices, which Steve Chu was talking about at the beginning of this presentation, also came with 0% debt. The financing terms matter a lot in terms of these costs. And so getting the financing right is part of what policymakers need to think about in order to support the innovation. And that matters as a function of market. Looking at two different markets, the US here versus China, the availability of these things in terms of where there's natural gas, where there's wind and so forth, what the price of coal is versus the price of gas really changes the cost profile for a lot of these things. It suggests that actually very soon in the United States, coal will not be economic. Kind of at a lot of price points. It also suggests that in China, coal will almost always be economic, which was also mentioned in our earlier talks. And so we have to be open-minded about what technologies we need. We really do need all of them. President Obama's position of all of the above is actually good statesmanship, it's good math, it's good science, and it's appropriate economics. So let's take a look at the energy systems themselves. This is China's energy system. This is the best data that we have on this. These are called energy flow diagrams. If you haven't seen these things before, I'd encourage you to go to Livermore's website, look for energy flow diagrams, and you can find these charts. Supply is on the left, conversion is in the middle, use is on the right, and it gives you a sense of where things go in the economy. If you look at this, you see a couple of things right off the bat. One of them is actually that currently there's not much energy use in transportation. There's a lot in industry. This has also been mentioned by other speakers. A lot of coal in the power sector. A lot of wasted energy, but as you'll see, not as much as in the United States. So the question is, if you were looking at this today, where would you want to focus your investment in China in terms of reducing carbon and improving the energy system? There's a couple of ideas that come to mind. One of them is you need different power sources that are not curtailed, that are not carbon emitting. Another thing is you'll want a different transportation system, because if that grows, then you have to avoid the emissions from that. You definitely have to tackle those industrial sources, and you might want to think about nuclear power as well. Not anybody else, there hasn't been much discussion today of nuclear. I'm going to touch on it briefly because China's making very large investments in it. So what kind of innovations might matter? As many people have said, this landscape for clean tech is changing in China substantially. I'm not going to belabor this a lot. I do want to point out a couple of things that haven't been talked about. One of them is the change of stance around the state-owned enterprises. In particular, the large oil and gas state-owned enterprises. There is a tension right now in China around the deep reform, and those companies are in the middle of it. How that shakes out will actually matter a great deal in terms of how this moves forward with any of these energy technologies. Similarly, there are still market jitters following the collapse of the shale price in Shanghai and other things. The capital flow today isn't what it was 3 years ago, and that also affects the way that investments happen and it affects the way that people think about risks. Still, this is the once-in-a-generation opportunity to build. Leaders in China know this, And they've known it for a long time. This is one of my favorite pictures. The picture of Deng Xiaoping with a mushroom cloud behind him, because he wanted a revolution in science and technology. And partly, the investments that China made in nuclear weapons actually helped spur their innovation infrastructure broadly. It created a generation of scientists and engineers. And he wanted to be the logistics officer for this revolution, and he put his money into it. He created NDRC, he created the Ministry of Science and Technology, he created projects like 863 and 973 to get the high technology reform going, and committed to these major mega projects in China. This was all part of a long-standing emphasis on science and technology. China is also basically taking an Olympic strategy around energy innovation. They're basically going for the gold in every event. They're putting money into every pathway, like the United States. They need to control pollution, they need to create jobs, they need to manage demand growth. And so they're going after all of it, and they're putting a lot of money into this. Maybe only a few $billion in R&D, but a lot of money into the deployment, which is also reducing the cost and gaining experience for all these things. I'm just going to touch again on these four areas of high importance. As Dr. Chu mentioned at the beginning, ultra-high voltage transmission is something where China is an uncontested global leader. And that's good news, because if they're going to avoid curtailment, they're going to take advantage of their extraordinary renewable resources. Here's just the wind capacity factor in China. You'll see that they've matched those pretty well with a bunch of transmission build-outs in order to get that capacity to market. There's still plenty of room to improve. But they've really now have by far the highest transmission lines. They have these dedicated facilities to test these things. They've got these enormous transformers for ultra-high voltage transmission, both DC and AC. They really have done tremendous innovation in this space. That will affect their ability to, say, among other things, have green electric vehicles. Speaking of electric vehicles, I wanted to show a couple of the weirder ones here. There are many Chinese companies making electric vehicles. There's a great deal of innovation in this space. As we discussed earlier, there's many companies working in this space, and they're trying to figure out what's going on. The core of whether or not this works is actually going to be innovation in terms of how State Grid and China's Southern Grid get this power to market and make it possible for electric vehicles to charge. There has been some substantial reform in this space, and we're starting to see the movement. But really, they are the sole monopolies dealing with the transmission and distribution networks. And that makes them very important players in terms of the electric vehicle space. The 13th five-year plan has a great wish for 5 million electric vehicles already. That has been pulled back already. They said now maybe 3 million instead of 5 million. Whether or not China hits these targets matters globally. It matters for supply chains. It matters for technology investment and development. It matters for competition globally, market interest, and not just in China, but for US and German, Japanese manufacturers. They are watching this market for real and hoping to compete. One of the big questions is actually, how are these cars used? Will they lead to the build-out of exurbs in suburbs? Will they be used entirely within cities? How will people charge? Does range anxiety matter as much in China? These are questions that are going to affect the innovation in terms of what battery designs are chosen, what weight and energy density are needed. And that's the core. The investment is going to follow the market here. Yeah, there's all kinds of lithium-ion factories out there, lots of Wanshangs as well. But there's just a lot of stuff that needs to happen. We need to get these high volumetric, high gravimetric density batteries, and that's a tough technical challenge. Right now, a lot of the manufacturers, including the ones in this room, are focusing on cost reduction. They're focusing on process intensification. That's good. Those are serious innovations. Maybe it's not the newest nanoparticle, but in fact, it will reduce costs to get these things to market, and it's proper innovation in the energy space. There's also been a focus on mergers and acquisitions. That is also appropriate. Both Goshen, BAIC, BYD, in particular, I'm thinking now of the BAIC acquisition with Fujian Benz. There's been these sort of opportunities to try to consolidate the market a little bit and also take advantage of other people's innovations. Oops, wrong way. We've only got a couple of minutes. Let me talk about industrial carbon capture and storage. I'm glad that Kate brought up the idea of industrial emissions. These dots that you see there are all the pure streams of CO2 in China today. All of those are coming from industrial sources. Fertilizer plants, ethylene plants, iron plants, power plants. There's just a huge amount of sources here. There's about 180 million tons of CO2, which is pure and concentrated today. If you captured that and stored it, there would be substantial emissions reductions. And this would be an important hedge against future carbon tariffs or border adjustable tariffs on these products. It's actually a good thing to think about. These are the stars, projects that have been identified under the Climate Change Working Group by the State Department and by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So these are the places to start. That yellow dot is the first one that's going up. This is being built in China at Yangchang Petroleum Company. It's on their coal to methanol plant. So we're seeing some progress here, but this is an area where innovation needs urgently to proceed. If we don't do that innovation, we won't hit our targets. Last for China is nuclear. Most people don't realize just how much is being built. And they're really going after all of it. Pebble beds, light water reactors, breeder reactors, they're going, thorium cycles, they're really going after all these technologies in a different way. It's a lot of steel, it's a lot of jobs, a lot of stuff. How they succeed or fail in this space will matter a great deal to the global clean energy enterprise as well as China's ambitions. Let me close quickly with just a focus on the United States. We have a very different energy system. You'll notice that our power sector is less efficient, that we have a much bigger transportation sector, and we use gas the way that China uses coal. This has all been discussed before. So we need to focus on a different set of things. Among other things, we need to focus on low-emission gas. We need to focus on decarbonizing the power sector in a different way and thinking about smart grid to balance these kinds of curtailments the way they did in Texas. We need to think about transportation efficiency. Maybe not just the electric vehicles, but we need to be thinking about lightweighting. We need to be thinking about hybridization. A whole other set of technologies might be the right solution in the United States, which requires a very different kind of investment. And last is broad efficiency. This demand destruction piece is huge. If we can get better about the way that we waste energy, we'll have a much brighter future all around. And I'll have to talk about the CERC another time. I've been pulled off the thing, but I do want to say just one thing about the CERC. This has been the envy of the world. I was very fortunate to be involved in this at the very beginning. And David Sandelo, who's here, and Secretary Chu really did create this partnership in a very specific and important way. There is a certain amount of challenge that has come out of this. Not everything has worked perfectly. Not everything has worked well. And I've got slides talking about that too. Nonetheless, it needs to be emulated and expanded. This is a terrific model to think about how to stimulate innovation between the two countries, and not just at sort of